discussed last week was I made the argument, the thesis, I put out there the thesis that people in general, humanity in general for the most part, people have a natural, instinctual, impulsive kind of belief in God, a pull to believe in God, the existence of some being that is transcendent, that is perfect, that is beyond this world, and we come to that natural, instinctive belief in a number of ways. For some people, it can come through simply a moment where you feel the presence of some transcendent being. That could be spending time with family, it could be a moment of great accomplishment, a moment I shared with my own personal example in my life when my first child was born, and just going into his room late at night and holding his hand. There was some presence that I felt in that moment beyond just the physical connection with my son at that moment. It can happen in a variety of different ways. People simply feel a presence of something transcendent, something mysterious, something beyond the physical world. It can happen through a desire for meaning. As human beings, as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs calls us, we are meaning-seeking beings. We seek meaning. We want there to be meaning in our lives. And for many, many people, what that means is that there's a natural belief, a natural instinct that there's some being that grounds this universe with some sort of purpose and some sort of meaning. That's a second way that some people have that natural, instinctual pull towards God. And a third way we mentioned is experiences. Sometimes there are supernatural experiences which sometimes people kind of shrug off. It's a coincidence. It's whatever it was a hallucination, something freak that happened. But there are these experiences that we often hear about of something crazy, something that seems supernatural. And for many people, that can also be kind of a natural, instinctual pull towards a belief in God. The last way of the natural impulses towards God that we mentioned were, so there's experience of a presence, and then there's nature, which is closely tied to that. But sometimes for many people, it's looking at a beautiful view, at the world, at the natural world, at some expanse, some mountain range, an ocean, whatever it is, some beautiful view, and sensing in that physical world that you're looking at that there's some mysterious quality beyond just the blades of grass or just the water or just the mountain. There's something there that seems to just be speaking to you. There's some presence of some godly presence. So those are all a variety of different ways, and for many people it can come with different permutations and different ways, but for many people, I think, have this natural, instinctual pull towards belief in God. If you remember the source we opened with last week, Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, one of the early to mid, I guess, actually, Hasidic teachers, taught that's why in the Torah, when it speaks about belief in God, it doesn't state it as a commandment. It says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your God. Not you should believe in me, just simply I am Hashem your God. Why is it stated as a simple fact, as something that is, and not something that's imperative, not something that's normative, that's telling you what to do? So argues Rav Tzadok is because belief in God just is. It's not something you have to do, it's something that simply is. With all that said, if you agree with that, the question is, if that's the case, then what happens? Is what we left off with last week, is what happens. So where does the faith go? So if that natural, instinctual belief in God is there, then where does it go? What happens to it? So what we left off with last time is that for many people, different things happen to it, but I think the main thing, in a sense, of what captures what happens for many people is questions. As we age, as we become more sophisticated, more mature in our minds, and we will just kind of buy into things with a little more hesitation. So we start to question those experiences. Is that legitimate justification? Is that a reason to believe in God? Is that enough of a reason to make this leap of faith, as it's often termed, right? As we age, as we become more sophisticated, we start to question these things a little more. We have questions. And the question that I posed to you and that I want to explore tonight in the second leg of this journey is, what is the third step? So if the first step is a natural pull towards God, and the second step is a pull back because of questions, so now what is the response to those questions? What is the response that we should take towards those questions if we want to give life to that faith that we started with in step one? So what I think throughout history, what many people have done is tried, as is natural, to answer the questions. Try and answer the question. So if I have a belief and I have a question about it, so let me try and come up with a way of answering the question, of dealing with the problem that I've encountered. And I think that's, as I said last week, I think it's a noble undertaking, but I think it's a profound mistake. I think it's a profound mistake. Not that the questions shouldn't be answered, but for that to be the exclusive approach to recapturing faith and giving life to that faith that we started with, I think that road doesn't lead to ultimate success. And the reason for that, as we'll soon explore, is because the human mind has a very difficult time proving things conclusively. It's very challenging for us as humans, as finite beings, to prove things conclusively. I shared last week this book I was reading called There Is a God. On the title it says there is not, and crossed out, not a God, written by someone who is apparently the most prolific atheist in the history of philosophy, who recently kind of converted, recently changed teams to now be atheist. And someone actually showed me that they bought the book after last week. We were just talking about it. And I find it fascinating because he actually writes about how he started off not believing in God, but as a philosopher, his philosophy always was, you follow the argument wherever it goes. You follow the argument where it goes. So he was never closed off of believing in God. He just personally felt that it was irrational. But he was never closed from it. So as modern science evolved, he actually found, opposite of what we often hear, he found that modern science, the concept of kind of the multiverse and all these different things, proved to him that there's no way of explaining, no logical way of explaining the existence of our world without positing that there is a God behind this world. And now he believes in God because of that. So what I can't stop myself from thinking, I'm just raising this to draw out the point here, I'm curious what you think, but what I can't stop myself from thinking is, okay, but what if tomorrow he decides that now the argument isn't good enough anymore? Right? Just you follow the argument wherever it goes. So okay, great. He has a new belief. But what is that really standing on? Is it so fickle? Is belief in God so flimsy? It's just one day the argument gets bent in this way, and the next day can get. So now he's going to write another book called "There Is Not crossed out a God," and then cross out that again and rewrite that. How many times is this going to get switched over? And does that make sense? That faith would just be hanging by such a thread that it's just going to sway back and forth over and over, just depending on whatever argument makes sense to you in that moment. Is that what it should be like? So I want to argue and suggest another path, as opposed to answering the questions, to kind of recapture and give birth again to that faith, that natural instinct of belief. But it's not blind faith of just saying, okay, we don't care about the questions, we don't care about the logic, we're just going to believe regardless. I think it has to be something a little bit more sophisticated than that. That's what I want to explore today. So before we really delve into it, it's just worth noting two, I guess, a little bit more simple challenges of faith, just before we get into the real crux of what I want to explore, just kind of simple challenges of faith. And the first is captured very well in this Calvin and Hobbes comic, where they're standing outside in the dark, starry night, and Calvin comments, "Look at all the stars. The universe just goes out forever and ever." And Hobbes says back, "It kind of makes you wonder why man considers himself such a big screaming deal." And then the next frame, you see them sitting inside with a TV, roaring. And he comments, "That's why we stay inside with our appliances." Right? So there's one aspect of the challenge of faith, which is just kind of more practical, not so philosophical, not so deep. It's just the simple fact that yes, we can have these meaningful spiritual experiences, these natural instincts towards belief in God, but then they get covered up with the fact that we're very busy, and we get occupied with lots of other things that can kind of impede upon our spirituality. So that's just one thing that's worth naming, which I think is true, certainly for myself, and I assume, I think for many people. The second thing I think is very important, and it relates, it's a little more practical, but it relates a bit more to the main argument that I want to look at, and that's in this book that I mentioned last week called God and the Philosophers, which is a collection of articles written by current, it's a pretty recently published book, written by current kind of top-notch analytic philosophers, most of them, and their reflections, and specifically philosophers who are religious people. Most of them are Christians. There's one I mentioned last week, David Schatz from Stern College, from Yeshiva University, is actually one of the articles in it. Most of them are written by Christian believers, and they reflect kind of on how they reconcile their philosophy and their faith, and there's a lot of really fascinating insights in their pieces. And here's one that I thought was particularly insightful, not in a philosophical sense, but in a psychological sense. And I think it's just worth noting before we really dive into the other ideas here. So he writes here, someone named William Alston. He writes, "I had been psyched into feeling that I was chickening out, was betraying my adult status if I sought God. I was walking one afternoon in the country outside Oxford, wrestling with the problem, when I suddenly said to myself, why should I allow myself to be cribbed, cabined, and confined by these Freudian ghosts? Why should I be so afraid of not being adult? What am I trying to prove? Who am I trying to impress? Whose approval am I trying to secure? Why should I hold back from opening myself to a transcendent dimension of reality, if such there be? just from fear of being branded as childish in some quarters. And I think there's so much truth to this. I mean, just speaking from my own experience, I feel this all the time. If I want to share a spiritual experience I have a little bit of a hesitation. Are people going to think I'm like a little child? Am I not going to sound smart enough if I share a more emotional side of experiencing this world? Am I not going to sound thought out and intellectual enough if I share just a more emotional experience? There's a bit of an inferiority complex that I think the post-Enlightenment age and this modern scientific age has created on sort of beliefs that are deemed things that are leaps of faith. And speaking from that more emotional, more spiritual place kind of carries with it sometimes a bit of an embarrassment, a bit of shame. I think for many people, if you don't have that, that's great. Personally, I do have that sometimes. And what he's writing about here is exactly that, and I think he captures it so well. So I think those are just two challenges of faith that I wanted to just point out before really going into the main topic I wanted to explore. And with that, let's look at a little bit at how I want to suggest another alternative path. Instead of answering the questions that come in and impede on our faith, another way of dealing with those questions. So it starts basically by, if you're not into philosophy so much, so just bear with me, the point here is not to get too caught up in the philosophical arguments. The point is going to be the upshot that comes out of the arguments I'm going to share with you in a second. These are going to be the kind of classic things that are annoying kind of arguments, the skeptical, like you can doubt everything in the world type of arguments, but I want to just use them to show you something that I think is important that emerges from realizing these types of arguments. So just bear with me if this is not usually your type of thing, maybe stretch and see how it goes. So, I mean, I just say that I guess because when I'm with my family and I bring up arguments like this, everyone wants to just kick me out, throw me out of the room. So I have a little bit of a fear of getting into these types of discussions too much. So there's, in the world of philosophy, something known as skepticism, which is often attributed to have started with a philosopher named Rene Descartes, where he started doubting his own existence. And people have heard of the argument, I'm sure, I think, therefore I am. That was his answer to his proving his own existence. But the skepticism started with saying, how do I know I exist as I think I exist? Maybe I exist as someone, maybe I don't exist at all in the way that I think I do. I'm just it's just some simulation in some ways, pre-technology, so he didn't think of all the ways we could think of that could be happening. But in whatever way, maybe this is just a simulation and I don't exist at all in the way I do. And he thought he had an answer to that question, and he thought he kind of got rid of it by the, I think therefore I am, etc., and many arguments he built after that. But in the end of the day, philosophers have basically, his arguments did not suffice to answer the question. The question remains, how do we know we exist the way we think we do? How do I know that any of you exist right now? Maybe you're just in my mind, and I'm speaking to ideas in my mind, but maybe there's no outside world outside of me. Maybe the person you're hearing talk right now is just in your mind. It's an illusion in your mind. There's no way for you to know that. And basically there's no way to prove conclusively from a purely like uber rational, logical perspective, there's really no way to conclusively, from an objective standpoint of logic, pure logic, to prove the existence outside yourself or even the existence of yourself as you think you know it, right? There's the classic, again, annoying argument of when you're dreaming, you think it's real, so how do you know when you're awake that it's not just also maybe some sort of a dream? How do you know? How do you know which one's real? How do you know which one's not? So there's all these types of arguments which we really can't actually come to a conclusive proof to refute these types of skeptical questions. Similarly, I'll show you an even more basic argument on something of this nature, which is what's known as here, if you look at the source sheet on the bottom of page 1, it's known as the problem of the criterion. And it basically goes like this. How do you develop, basically the point is that we actually can't prove logic at all. Meaning this entire discussion of what can I prove, what can't I prove, is actually assuming that there's something justified, a method, a tool that we use that we call logic, that we call rationality, we call reasoning. But the question is, how do we know we should trust logic at all in the first place? How do we know it's a justified method? Maybe it's a bad method. Maybe it's flawed. How do we know we can prove it? So the problem is like this. It's going to be a circular catch-22 problem, because to prove a method as being legitimate, you have to have a test, right? So you have to have something you know is true, something you know is false, to be able to say, does this method work to determine truth or falsehood? Does that make sense? To be able to prove if a method is a legitimate method, is a working method, I have to have something to test it against. So I have to have a control that I know is either true or false, and then I can look at this method and say, will this method work to be able to determine truth and falsehood in other instances? Does that make sense? That would be a reasonable way of trying to figure out a method to determine truth or falsehood. But what's the problem with that? What's the problem with that? What do you say?
Your method.
What do you mean?
You're using the method to prove the method.
So the problem is even before that. The problem is that in order to determine the method, I have to have something that I know is true, something I know is false. But if I don't have a method yet, how do I know what's true and what's false? So I don't have any control to be able to test the method. I have to have a method in order to establish something is true and false. Once I have something that's true and false, now I can test the method. But I can't have the control until I have a method. So you kind of just go around in a circle, and you basically have to just take a leap of faith to make logic be what we consider logic, because you can't actually establish it from a purely rationalistic standpoint. There's a fundamental flaw in logic getting off the ground. Okay, that's one example, again, of another point where we see kind of the limits of human reasoning, where human rationality is not as objective and pure as we might think. I'll give you kind of a couple more points on this. There's, I guess maybe my favorite philosopher is someone named David Hume. He's a Scottish philosopher, and he has an argument that, any scientists here? Scientists don't generally like this. You know, I'm from a family of scientists, but I'm by no means whatsoever a scientist. And he basically said that all of science is kind of fundamentally flawed in its logic. He's not arguing, the point of any of this, as we'll try and tease out soon, the point of any of these arguments or these questions is not to say that we shouldn't believe these things or use these things. The point we'll see is that we justify them not from as purely rationalistic of a standpoint as we might have thought. That's the point. You'll see what I mean soon. So David Hume argued that you actually can't prove. What does science try and do? Science tries to determine laws and principles of nature based on past occurrences, and then use those to establish laws of the universe to project into the future, right? In a simplified manner, right? We try and study science, and we can use that to now establish things going forward. The question is, why am I justified, asked David Hume, in assuming that anything that happened in the past will necessarily happen in the future? So just because I've proven gravity, that if I let go of this phone, it's going to fall and not fly up to the ceiling, or it's just hover in midair. So if I did that, it would fall, right? So that just happened right now. But how do I know that when I let go of it right now, it's going to happen again? So it will. But how do I know that? How can I prove that? So we're assuming that because it happened in the past, it's going to happen in the future, right? So take the following analogy. Bertrand Russell once gave the analogy. He said, take a poor turkey. Okay? The turkey has a wonderful owner who every day comes out and gives it food, and every single day now, after the first day and the second day and the third day, this turkey starts to get excited whenever the turkey sees this owner. And this goes on for a long time, for hundreds of days actually. It goes on for 364 days. And then one day comes, and it's Thanksgiving morning, and the turkey gets all excited to see its owner, and unfortunately, it was not food that the owner was coming to bring the turkey. Was the turkey justified in assuming that it should be excited to see the owner that morning, that Thanksgiving morning? It happened 364 times in a row, without fail. Every single time the turkey saw the owner, it got food. Every time, 100% of the time, for 364 days in a row. So why should we assume that because something happened in the past, it'll happen again in the future? If there's something objectively rational about it. So for example, I know that 1 + 1 equals 2 will always be, not just in the past. But that's because I don't know it through experience. I know it because it's automatic by its own definition. Or, for example, I know that there can't be something that's a circular square. There can't be a circular square. And that'll always be true. But that's not something I know because of my experience of circles and squares. It's something I know because by definition it can't be. But something like gravity is not something that by definition we should intuit. There's nothing more objectively logical about the fact that when you let go of the phone, it's going to fall and not fly up to the ceiling or hover in midair. There's nothing more logical, objectively. If we had never experienced this world before, we would never have assumed as obviously logical that when you let go of things, they fall. You never would have assumed that. There's nothing, what we call a priori logical, objective about gravity. It's just something we know through the fact that we've experienced it so many times. But that's not a justified reason to project it into the future. That's only justified in knowing that it happened in the past. So why is science justified? And why are we justified in projecting things into the future? So says David Hume, simply, from our own habit, from our experience. So the point, again, of all these arguments is not to say that we should doubt any of those things. It's to show that we don't know those things from as logical, as sound reasoning vantage point as we may have thought. They actually come from a more complex experience of the world. The human being is more complex than that. And sometimes the way we set things up is that the logical function, the logical faculty that humans have, kind of becomes like the police over the other faculties that we have. And we have other ways of experiencing things, but everything has to pass under the watch of that rational faculty. And the question is, does that actually work? If we would do that for everything, we might not actually be justified in believing almost anything we believe. And the upshot of this is that we are more complex beings than that. And we gather justified beliefs by more than just the logical part of ourselves. In Kabbalah, there is something known as the 10 sfirot. Anyone ever hear of this? The 10 sfirot, the Esser sfirot. So these are kind of the different ways. If you take the analogy I like to give, there's different analogies in Kabbalah, but I think the most accessible analogy is if you imagine kind of a one giant beam of light, like a spotlight. Okay, there's like a one color spotlight right here, shining upwards. Okay, and if I take kind of like a disc that has 10 different circle lenses on that disc, and each lens is a different color, and I place it over that beam of light. So now on the other side of those lenses, I'm looking at the beam of light. What do I see now? I see 10 independent or 10 different colored beams of light. So if you're standing on the other side of this disc, you think that if you didn't know any better, you might think that there are actually 10 different lights, each of a different color. But in fact, they're actually coming from one source of one light, which is actually completely in itself one unified light, but it gets expressed in 10 different modes. So the Esser Sfirot are the Kabbalistic concept of creation in a very simplified way, is the idea that God, as oneness, as light being a metaphor to God's being able to express and being able to give off of God's self, to give way to something outside of itself. So the Sfirot are how God went from one to be multiple. The Sfirot takes that beam of light, which is God shining light, to give way to creation, and the Esser Sfirot are these different color lenses that God put over God's self to allow for there to be on the other side the expression of God in many, many different ways. Does that make sense on some simple level? What Hasidut came and did, one of the things that Hasidut did with the Baal Shem Tov, is that there's a psychologization of that concept as well. That within each of us, there are 10 basic different modes, and with lots of different permutations and specifics, but 10 basic different modes of being in this world. Because if God's light is expressed into giving way to creation through those 10 lights, so everything in this world is made up of that basic DNA of 10 different forms of being. And within ourselves, there's these 10 different forms of being also. The point being that one of those 10 lights, of those 10 color lenses over the general light, is something called Bina. Bina is the realm of logical thinking. The important point is that it's one of 10. It's one of them, it's an important one, but it's one of 10. And there are lots of other different ways of being. There's lots of other different parts of ourselves, different faculties, different modes, different ways we experience the world, and different ways that we come to have justified beliefs, and justified values, and justified opinions. In the world, not all of them have to pass under this police of the rational realm of Bina. They can come through experiences. I know that someone loves me when I experience their love for me, not because I've proven it through some argument. If I get in an argument, I guess that probably wouldn't happen. But not because I've proven it through some rational proof, but because I've experienced it. I know certain things not because of logical reasoning, but because of different ways of experiencing the world. And the argument about belief in God as the third step to belief in God is exactly the same thing. Is that belief in God doesn't have to be something that is argued, that we can answer the questions. We started off arguing or suggesting that we may all have experiences of God in our lives. Experiencing God in different ways, that we have a natural instinctive pull towards a belief in God. Then we have questions that come onto the belief and that hinder that belief. The question is, how do you respond to those questions? So what I'm suggesting is that we don't have to respond by answering them necessarily. We respond to them by understanding that as human beings we are limited in our ability to prove things conclusively from a rational standpoint. But we're justified in our beliefs through the experience, the immediate encounter that we have. So just like I believe in the fact that you are all sitting here and you're not just in my mind, the reason that I believe that is because I'm experiencing you right now. Is because the experience is immediate, it's sensory, it's something that is just, it's unavoidable. So to my belief in God, if the experience is strong enough, that it's something that's justified by virtue of the experience itself, even without reasoning. Does that make sense? Does that resonate? Yeah.
It makes sense to me, but I think I'm going to try and use logic to counter. It sounds like you're saying that belief in God belongs to the, let's just call it G, belongs to the class of beliefs that you can't prove rationally.
Which I'm saying is actually the class of all beliefs.
The class of all beliefs.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean, therefore, that all beliefs are necessarily justified.
Correct.
Just because there's some beliefs, like believing that the phone is going to drop, which are also not rationally provable, doesn't mean that belief in God belongs in that same category.
Correct. So 100%. So the to clarify, if I didn't say this, I meant to or should have, but this approach only gets off the ground and it only has validity because of the point you're saying right now for someone who has the experiences of spirituality, which is my suggestion that I think many, many, many people do, or many of us could or would if we weren't kind of hindered by the questions or by the inferiority complex of belief or by occupied with the different challenges that we spoke about. But it only is true, meaning the question, let's say, of what you're asking is, so which ones are valid, which ones are justified? So what I'm basically arguing is that the ones that are justified are the ones that are immediate experiences that you almost can't avoid because they are experiences that are so real and so alive that you can doubt them, but they're inescapable, right? There's a source here I want to show you, and then take your question. We can go back to your question. Tell me if it still speaks to this. There is a great little piece in that book, God and the Philosopher. So I mentioned to you that someone named David Schatz from Michigan University has a piece in there. So his piece is titled, "The Over-Examined Life is Not Worth Living." Anyone know what that's a play on? So it's a play on Plato's line that the unexamined life is not worth living. So he calls it the over-examined life is not worth living. And in there, he speaks to this point in a way that I think is very powerful and very important. So he writes here on the bottom of page 2, Hume was fascinated by the divorce between philosophy and practical life. In my study, he said, I come to appreciate that I lack adequate grounds for all sorts of things I take for granted in my life. The regularity of nature, the reality of the physical world. So when I'm in my study, I can doubt all these things, I can question them, I can engage in a philosophical discourse, arguing skeptically that they don't exist. And he writes, yet when I exit, those intellectual infirmities have not the slightest influence on my belief system. A philosophical skeptic, someone who casts doubt on our grounds for these and other common beliefs, cannot live his skepticism, Hume holds. Even in his study, in fact, Hume isn't really a skeptic. He doesn't doubt he's putting pen to paper, and doesn't wonder whether the paper will abruptly pop out of existence. That nobody is really a skeptic, even while philosophizing, becomes clear if you watch what we philosophers do, not what we say. When a philosopher publishes an article called Why There Are No People, an actual title, he invites a joke. Whom does he think he's writing for? Whom will he blame if he gets turned down for tenure? Hume's point, however, was probably normative as well as descriptive. Hume taught us, in effect, that it is a vice to be too rational, to hold out for rigorous arguments in all walks of life. Only a mad person would want to conduct his or her life with complete Spock-like logicality. We are possessed not of minds alone, but of hearts, emotions, needs, instincts, and habits. And we inhabit social contexts. So the point he's making is that we can make all the skeptical, logical arguments we want, but the things that are such real and vivid experiences, that there's such immediate encounters, we can have the best logical argument in the world, but we cannot convince ourselves that the reality we're encountering is not true, because if you're encountering it, then it's true for you. And you can talk about doubting it, you can talk about being skeptical, but you can't actually live that doubt, you can't actually internalize that doubt, that skepticism. So which arguments which beliefs fall into the class of beliefs that even if I can't prove them, I can accept them based on experience. So I think there's two factors, and I don't have a defined or really kind of perfect way of saying what should be a member of that class and what shouldn't, and I think that's actually a pretty personal endeavor of deciding. I don't think that you can really determine that for somebody else, but I'd say, in my mind, there's kind of two guidelines. One is that it's a question of, again, how strong is the experience? Something that is direct, immediate experience, immediate encounter. So then, that's what Hume is saying, what David Schatz is saying, is that we actually, if it's that immediate experience, you almost become choiceless in the matter. It becomes something that's just part of you. It's so real to you, it's inescapable, it's unavoidable. That's guideline number one. So the question is, how real are the experiences? How immediate are the encounters? Guideline number two, I would say, is the difference between irrational and irrational, which is a very important distinction in this context. What I'm suggesting is not that we can take on or adopt beliefs that are irrational because we say we've had some experience of them. That would be a whole further step of the argument, which is not where I'm suggesting to go with this. Right? Something that is against logic, something that doesn't make sense. So that's a different question of should we believe that because of experience or not, and maybe yes, maybe no. But belief in God is not something that's irrational. It might be something we can't prove, but the fact that we can't prove it doesn't make it irrational. Like irrational again would be like a circular square. So when someone told me that they experienced the circular square, I would have a very difficult time wrapping my head around what exactly that meant, despite however real that experience may have been. Right? Because it's actually against logic, or that 1 + 1 = 3. It's something that's against, it's irrational. But to say that something is not provable, not conclusively provable, there's nothing illogical about the existence of God, offhand. There's problems, there are issues. Of course, the problem of evil is of course a major, major challenge. But it's not something irrational. It's not something that you can't explain, or that you can't make a logical argument for. It's something you can't prove conclusively. That's a very, very important distinction. So if something is an immediate, direct experience encounter, and something is not irrational, then I think there's room to then talk about, should this be welcomed into the class of beliefs that can be justified even without full conclusive proof? And then that's a decision that people make on their own. But those are the two guidelines I see in this kind of class of beliefs. Yeah?
So what would you say to a Christian who has like a very strong feeling that Jesus is God?
Mm-hmm.
Would you accept it? Would you say it falls in like the realm of irrationality? Like how would you classify it?
On a very personal level, actually I would say I just respect it and don't really know what the answer is. On a more philosophical level, I don't know, it doesn't bother me so much, meaning I'm not surprised. It doesn't challenge me from my perspective of truth or religious belief that there would be other religions formed. Meaning I don't think we live in a certain enough world that I would expect there not to be variations of religion.
Well, let me take
That doesn't make me feel any less confident in my belief. It just means that I understand that there's got to be many beliefs formed in such an uncertain world. Does that make sense? I still feel fully confident in my belief.
So let me just go further then,
Yeah.
and then say like, okay, something completely different to Judaism that somebody believes in like several idols and different gods.
Mm-hmm.
So this cannot be reconciled with Judaism. What would you reply to that?
What would you reply?
I'd be like, that's illogical.
So you're saying I can't say that anymore? Right.
Oh, no.
Well, but I guess you would have to think about the specifics of it, because the second guideline that I'm suggesting, right, is that there's a distinction between illogical and kind of illogical, right? So if something was truly illogical, then I wouldn't think that the approach I'm suggesting now would be kind of impotent towards dismissing that. Does that make sense? If it was actually logical.
Right. Like, it's kind of what, I imagine would be a good answer that, like, if someone says Jesus is God, like, maybe you'd be willing to go through and say, like, no, like, that's illogical because of, like, what God must be.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. Maybe, potentially. But, it's a good question. It's a strong question. I don't know, the answer. To me, it doesn't feel so challenging. It just doesn't feel surprising to me that there would be other beliefs out there. Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a flaw in this way of thinking about religion, right? If this leads you to be more, less confrontational or less aggressive towards other religions, that's not
right. That's not right. It's not something. Right. That's not a problem in this approach necessarily. Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
But it doesn't. But what if he said he was God, or that God talks to him?
Oh, you mean if I spoke to a person who told me that they were God?
Right. Or told you that they were a prophet of God.
Cult, basically.
Say it again.
Any kind of cult.
A cult. Right. Right.
Well, I mean, this is something where it's more. Obviously not true, or so.
Right.
It's not something about. It's not maybe just divorcing the whole interfaith thing from it.
Right.
To just talk about.
So I mean, just to kind of give, I guess, like the context to where I think this is an important approach and a useful approach is it's not this approach doesn't, which is kind of what you're all pointing out. It doesn't make the case for convincing someone or it's not grounds for an objective argument or trying to say to someone, this is why you should believe. This is, if it wasn't so cliche because it's the title of a book that, people read in like seminary and you're in the gap year in Israel, I would say that this is permission to believe, right? So I try not to use that because it's too cliche, but it's not an argument that, it's not proof for belief, this is permission to believe. So those are good questions, but I don't see them as being affronts to the fact that I can say that I feel justified. And this is all that this amounts to is, again, the following argument is that I feel justified in using my experiences of God and spirituality to form the belief in God, even if I can't conclusively prove it to you. That's the whole argument. Now, personally, I think that in those two very simple sentences, that's a huge, huge amount of value. But that's the argument and not more than that. It's not meant to be more than that. It's meant to say that I've had experiences of spirituality. I've had experiences of God in my life. I feel justified in believing in those experiences and belief in God from those experiences, even if I can't sit down on a train next to someone and say, here's why you should believe in God. Here's how I can prove God to you. I still feel justified in it. And going back to what I mentioned before in that book of there is a God with the not crossed out, and what about the fact that so now belief just sways, it's so fickle, it's so flimsy, it just goes back and forth all the time. The point is that to me at least, this is just experientially sharing from a personal standpoint, but experientially, it doesn't feel right to me that belief in God should be something that is it's hanging by a thread of one day this argument makes sense and one day this argument doesn't make sense. And now it's just going to go back and forth and you write one book and the next book is... So the belief in God that comes from experience is something that's so much more grounded. It's something that's so much more real. It's hard for me to imagine belief in God that comes purely from a rational standpoint. I do believe that rational plays a role in it. I actually enjoy and spend a nice amount of time studying and trying to think about answers to the questions. So my point wasn't to say that we shouldn't try and answer the questions, but my point is that the groundwork for then engaging in answering those questions is the fact that there's a belief based on experience. Because that's actually what belief in God, proving God on a piece of paper or on a logical proof. I mentioned last time that there was a philosophy professor I had in YU who had like some really long, complicated step proof of God. Someone named David Johnson, like one of these really, really brilliant people, like in a different wavelength of brilliance. And he was he believed in God, and he thought he had some proof for it. Are you a different person now that you have some proof that God exists based on like 100 steps? To me, that doesn't seem to resonate with what it means to be a believer in God. Right? Those things are important if you've had the experience which grounds belief in God as belief in God. It's not the proof of it. That may give justification or not, but the experience of God is what belief in God is about. Yeah.
So I kind of have trouble with the illogical versus alogical distinction.
Okay.
So I think, in a sense, it seems to me like you're kind of in this shift by freeing people for this grounding experiential kind of belief. Mm-hmm. You're moving towards subjectivity and away from towards, I guess, what you would call a pretense of objectivity. Mm-hmm. Right? We never really have objectivity because we're the turkey. Right. But you're saying it's okay to be the turkey and you don't know.
And you're automatically the turkey.
Right. So it's like cognitive bias, right? It's just you're saying it's okay to be path dependent in this because you're path dependent in everything else. Yeah. Science is necessarily path dependent. But when you kind of free people towards that subjectivity, the content of that subjectivity is completely up for grabs.
Yeah.
Right? And so isn't that in a way kind of a dangerous game to play, isn't it?
So it may be a dangerous game to play. I guess my question is there a different game that you can play?
So you can continue to have this pretense of objectivity, right? And so you can say, like, we're one step better than the turkey because we know that turkeys get slaughtered, right? Maybe we don't believe that,
Right.
Maybe you can say they're all equally
But we are
illogical.
but it's just a relative sliding scale because to something else we are just the turkey again.
Well, but that's what you're saying with alogical versus illogical, right? Maybe it's a preponderance of 51% and now you're at alogical.
You're saying because I'm still assuming that there is something that is illogical, so I'm assuming that there could be objectivity? Is that your...
Well, so ostensibly there's something between, you believe in Judaism, that's fine, you believe in Christianity, that's fine, Scientology, maybe you're pushing it, guy, yelling on the street or something,
Right.
I'm God, maybe that's a little bit too crazy.
Right.
So it's a line drawing question, right? There's some percentage where it becomes alogical rather than illogical.
Mhm.
So you're ultimately still
I guess
shifting.
the other thing, I think it's a good point, and I think it's similar to the other points that were made. And again, I think that the question is, you might be right, or you are right, and what's the other option? It's kind of just being honest with ourselves. I mean, in my opinion, a lot of this is just being honest with ourselves. So we can function with a pretense of objectivity, but it's just a pretense, right? So, and the question is that I wouldn't use this argument to prove the validity of specifics of a religion. I think that this argument is more usable and more valid for sort of basic beliefs, like a belief in God, okay, where, the overwhelming majority of the world believes in God. And even atheists have loud voices, but the overwhelming amount of people in the world believe in a God, in the existence of a God. So more basic beliefs. If you get into specifics of a religion versus another religion, versus a cult, versus whatever it is, so I'm not sure that this argument would actually, not just that I wouldn't want to use it because it's dangerous, I'm not sure it actually work, because what does it mean to experience the validity of it? Just thinking out loud, I guess, it could be brought into that realm also. It's something to think about, where it ends its useful life. But I think with something as kind of basic as belief in God, I think there it's a lot more reasonable. And again, I think the point is that you're right, and you were both right also, but the question is there anything besides that other than a pretense, which is just a pretense, right? So I want to just, we have a few more minutes left. I want to kind of just read through a few sources that I think are just capture this idea, not really adding new points, but just they capture this idea that we've been discussing in really rich language that I think is important just to see and to bring it all together through this language. So again, back to that book on the philosophers, there's an article by a woman named Laura Garcia, and she writes there, if you remember, she was the person who last week we quoted from her talking about how she came to believe in God through living in a very open nature environment and living kind of in the mountains and experiencing nature. And she writes there basically this exact point. Some will see, if we're on page 3, right under section C, some will see in this, meaning in her saying that she believes in God based on experience, nothing more than a short and unconvincing version of the design argument for God's existence. But that is not how I would describe it. Rather, it seems to me as though I felt God's presence in the beauty of these natural wonders, that I was standing before Him, their maker and their life. From the perspective of the believer, coming to God often seems like more an encounter than solving a math problem. What she's saying is she doesn't mean that when she experiences God in nature, then now she has some logical proof to say, if there's nature, it must be that there's a God who's the cause of that, and that cause has to have a cause, so it must be that it goes back to some unmoved mover, to some uncaused cause, and some Aristotelian version of this God. That's not the point. The point is that experiencing God in nature is just an experience of God that brings you to belief in God. Just there, that's the whole thing. That's the entirety of it. And Rav Soloveitchik actually speaks about this. This is basically in a little bit of a different way, because his view of the natural instinct towards belief in God is fascinating. It's through nature, it's through a lot of the things we spoke about, but the most, this is just in the way I understand, it will be kashta misham, and from there you shall seek, that his natural pull towards God is the restlessness of being a human being. It's the fact that we have this kind of unquenched thirst, this yearning, this aspiration for something that's out there that we don't get our fill of. And that's the instinctual pull towards God. So I'm not going down that whole path, it's interesting. But in the end, his argument is basically the exact argument we've been making. If you look here in the second source under section C, he writes, while this conception medieval and early modern philosophy's use of logic, was intended to uproot and deny. It found itself implanting and affirming. It denied the possibility of using logical proofs to make indirect inferences from finitude to infinity, from temporality to eternity, from actuality to transcendence. Okay, if you know all those different hints towards different philosophical arguments, not so important. But instead of abolishing these proofs, it accepted them anew as immediate experiences that are not based on logical inferences, but rather are manifested in sudden revelations and insights. These experiences have nothing in common with indirect inference or logical deduction, just as consciousness of the world in general and of the self in particular do not involve logical demonstrations, but constitute the spiritual essence of man. So too with the experience of the divine. And he writes similarly in the next source, in Lonely Man of Faith, the trouble with all rational demonstrations of the existence of God, with which the history of philosophy abounds, consists in their being exactly what they were meant to be by those who formulated them. Abstract logical demonstrations divorced from the living primal experiences in which these demonstrations are rooted. For instance, the cosmic experience was transformed into a cosmological proof, meaning an experience was moved from an experience of an immediate encounter to a proof of a logical argument. Does the loving bride in the embrace of her beloved ask for a proof that he is alive and real? Must the prayerful soul clinging in passionate love and ecstasy to her beloved demonstrate that he exists? If it's an immediate experience, then it doesn't need further proof. And I think that this is really kind of an important reflection to have in our religious lives, which is the idea that more than focusing on the talking about God, talking about concepts in Judaism, talking about ideas and Torah, there is another element that I think is so important, and in many communities, I don't know this community that well yet, but in many communities is kind of missing. It's very challenging to create, which is not talking about God or learning Torah about ideas, but actually just experiencing spirituality, experiencing Judaism in a way that it's so real that the questions can't do much to it. It's a question of what is our belief is a function of our experience, according to this approach. And the question is, are we giving life to those experiences? It's something that we can create. I said it happens naturally, and I think it does happen naturally, but it's also something that's totally in our control. It's a question of how much effort, how much opportunity, how open are we to trying to create those experiences and allow those experiences to happen to us. To be open to the possibility of experiencing something spiritual, something mystical, something mysterious, to be looking for those experiences, trying to find ways to cultivate them and allow that to happen. And I think that's something that's very challenging in this world where we're so busy and we have so many different things, and people are so rational thinking in many ways, and there's the inferiority complex and there's the preoccupations with so many different things. But that's the question here, is that religion, as I want to now explore in the last leg of this journey next week, the question is, where does religion fit into this? So this is all about belief in God, but that's not religion necessarily. Where does religion come into this? And I think the important piece is that religion comes not from belief in God, but the experience of God. Believing in the existence of God doesn't give way to religion. What gives way to religion is the experience of feeling that God is concerned for our world, that God cares about us. That's what allows there to then be our response. If God is reaching out to us, we then have that reciprocal instinct to reach back out to God, and that forms the communion, the fellowship between God and human. And that's the foundation of religion. And that's why the experiential side of things is so important. As much as learning Torah is important and talking about these things is important, but it doesn't go very far if there's not the experience that it's founded on. So hopefully next week, for Make It, I look forward to trying to continue this and translate this into what is the role of halacha, what is the role of mitzvah in this framework of moving from this belief in God type of approach to then actually translating it into a religious lifestyle, not just belief in God, but something that we're living in our daily lives. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Everyone's invited back next week, as just said. I also want to point out the deadline for the shul dinner a week from Friday to get a discounted price is midnight tonight. We have a scholar residence lecture on Friday night with the history of the Israeli rabbinate. A timely, interesting topic, and the price to go out tomorrow. So, thank you again.
Thank you. What's your name?
Sal.